All right, guys. So episode 11, can you believe it, of Office Hours in GNU, Liam? I'm excited about today because it's a topic that you have expertise in, but I don't think a lot of people know, which is technology. And
Yeah,
so,
yeah, for sure.
and I'm ready to jump in. And I think for the audience, I'd love for them to know what your experience level is. You know, how far back do we go? How many years did you spend in technology and IT? So you build a foundation for them and tell them, and then we can go from there. How's that sound?
Yeah, no, that sounds fine because you're right. It's not the kind of thing people would really expect of me, and I've not been professional in the field for quite a long time now. I'm honestly about 20 years out of the field as a professional, but
Mhm.
because I spent so long in it, I keep a toe in it. I follow a lot of the news around it, follow releases, and still find a lot of it really fascinating. And the basic structure of things doesn't really change a whole lot, which you'll see as we get to talk about some of this stuff too. But yeah, I was always a bit of a hacker as a kid. And okay, so people use hacker in like a lot of just popular culture stuff to mean people who break into computers,
Mhm.
but hacker actually just means a coder or computer nerd, right? Somebody who works with computers. So I was like an old school hacker. Growing up as a kid, I used to tear machines apart. I was writing my first programs on the TI-99 computer that came out in the late 70s. My first programs were stored on like a C30 cassette that went into a
Oh
little
my God.
cassette deck that plugged in with RCA wires. It was just
I remember those,
old school shit.
like 70s and
But
80s.
yeah, so I always kind of enjoyed that stuff, and then I found an opportunity because no one in my family had ever gone to college. We weren't wealthy, so my first good professions that kind of took me out of like the waterfront, took me out of like the port or whatever, was computers. I got involved in working as a network consultant and a computer consultant. So like rebuilding machines for people. So I had a relationship with an OEM in the area. I would do custom builds, bring machines out, set them all up for people, network everything, and then from there it just went up and up and up. And the last position I had in the late '90s and early aughts was at a small aerospace startup that was doing a new kind of like turboprop pusher plane. Really cool plane, but the investors ended up screwing us and shutting the company down. But we don't need to get into that. But uh, at that point, I was network manager. I was linking together locations in California, Texas, Maryland, and New York with like secure VPNs, doing like security stuff on it. I actually on the shop floor, because you got a shop floor because they're building an airplane, right?
Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
they're working there doing this stuff, and I actually replaced all the computers out there with basically terminals that I built myself. It was just like
No way.
I would take a stripped down old PC, remove like the little floppy disk, because floppies used to be a thing, put it inside so they couldn't actually take it out, and on that little one meg floppy, it was enough of a boot image for Linux to boot them onto the network, and then it loaded up a screen for them that was running on a server in the server room. So if somebody's computer went bad, because they would go bad all the time, dust would fly into them, people would hit them with things. I mean, they would break, right? I could go out, unplug that machine, plug another one in, and they would pick up exactly where they left off. Same applications, same everything, because it's not running on the local machine. Saved us a ton of effort and money, and so I definitely have experience in the field and working with this stuff, and I've kind of again kept a finger in it the whole time. But I haven't been professional for a long time, so again, people are not likely to know this.
We need to show them a copy of a floppy disk for the younger generation. How many years all in all, Liam, would you say you spent in technology and IT?
Professionally, let's see. So, professionally, about 15 years.
That's a long time.
All told. Although 8 or 9 of those were really intensive. A few years at either end, I was kind of like overlapping in different fields. But it's about 2 decades professional experience,
That's a lot.
and then a lifetime of tearing shit apart and rebuilding it.
That's an extensive amount of time. And so today's topic, what did you want to cover today in terms of topic. If you can break it down for us.
Yeah, the easy thing is for introducing this, it comes from some discussions in our community Discord server, and some people were asking questions about Linux systems, and generally speaking about how to set up operating systems, how to dual boot like multiple operating systems on a computer. So I figured one thing I can do is give people sort of like a high level overview of what the operating system is and what the major ones are and why they, what are the advantages and disadvantages of them. And then, if you'll forgive me, I'd like to kind of tub thump a bit about the free software movement.
Yeah, please.
Because it's something that's been around for a long time, but is still way below the radar for most people. And it makes so much like economic sense, security sense. It would be such a practical transition for us. And we're almost completely oblivious to it, just ignoring it all, and just, whatever comes on the computer, you go in the store, you buy the computer. Oh, okay, I guess I'm running Windows or whatever. People seem to think that Apple's the only other choice.
Right.
And Apple locks you in even more than Windows does. And they're not the only choice. Thump
all you want, man. Thump all you want. I don't mind at all. I do have a question for those watching. So when you think, say Linux, what does that describe what Linux is? Because look, for folks that don't get engrossed in technology, what is that?
Okay, so the first thing then to hit, so we want to talk a little bit about what an operating system is, and Linux is an operating system, so that gives you a start there. The first thing is, so you've got your computer hardware, right? You've got equipment in there, and your computer is going to have like the motherboard that everyone's connected into, and it's going to have like some kind of hard drive, whether solid state or a disk or whatever that holds your data. And it's going to have, RAM, which holds the programs that are running in memory. They're like physical parts of the computer. And there's a few bits of software that are kind of built into that to start it up, to fire up the equipment. But after that, it passes over to an operating system. And the operating system then takes control of the hardware and does everything with it. The Linux kernel, the kernel is like the core of an operating system, is the core of an overall operating system. Now, operating system isn't just the kernel. It's also all the interface, like how you put programs on it, how you interface with it, all that kind of stuff, right? So it includes both the kernel of the operating system, what controls the hardware and manages all the resources, and then all that user space software that sits on top of that.
Got it.
And then you add the rest of your junk onto it. But the basic interface, like how do you communicate with the computer, all that kind of stuff, all that is sort of separate from the kernel of it. Linux is technically just a kernel. And people who were around this stuff as long as I was, and just as a small editorial note, I'm familiar with Windows and Mac only from supporting other users on them, from doing that professionally. I didn't run this stuff. I was a Unix geek and went into Linux. So I'm kind of like native in that environment, but I'm fluent in the others as well to varying degrees.
No, that's good. Why kernel instead of general?
Why was that?
Why kernel instead of general?
That's neat. Yeah. Okay, so a little
bit of humor
there, like, but kernel, like the kernel of a corn, like the core of something.
Yeah.
But yeah, but you're right. It is kind of the general, because it does actually control all the resources. It manages how. Okay, so this application is allowed to use RAM. This application is allowed to use the GPU to this extent, and it keeps things from crashing. This is one of the reasons that, honestly, Windows eventually became so unstable, is that a lot of the core of its operating system was not written well enough, and as it kept scaling up, it caused more and more problems because it couldn't keep different applications from interfering with the hardware or interfering with each other. So if you've ever seen that the blue screen of death, right?
Yes, I have.
That's what we call a kernel dump. Like the operating system just goes and just dies because something interfered with something else, right?
Right.
Now, again, for people who've been around in this as long as I have, the technical operating system for Linux is actually GNU, and then it's GNU/Linux. Linux is the kernel of it, and you can actually put the GNU, all the applications, on other kernels, but Linux ended up kind of winning that that race for the most part. But there used to be competitors like Minix and whatever, and you can still run it on things like the BSD kernel, which is a free version of Unix. And, you can use all those applications on different Unix variants. So GNU doesn't have to be Linux, but Linux always includes the GNU space, the basic core of the operating system that sits on it. Right. The advantage of building something like this, and one of the problems that you run into with things like Windows, is that the kernel and the operating system in Windows are joined. And all the operating system elements include things like the GUI, or graphical user interface. So all the, you're moving your mouse around and you're doing things, right, with the computer.
Right.
If that crashes on a Linux machine, the operating system hasn't actually crashed. It's still running. It's just frozen. And you can switch to a terminal emulator and access it, and like kill whatever process went crazy, and boom, you're back up and running. So the Linux system can just keep running consistently for years without a problem. Windows can't really do that, because any application running in user space, like you're playing a video game, or you're running an Office application or something, you can actually crash the entire operating system because of the way they've blended it together.
Got it.
Linux separates the kernel and the OS, so that one basically runs the hardware and keeps the whole system working, and all the rest of the applications are in user space. I can talk a little bit more about the security aspect of it later, because it also really affects security. Windows systems are a lot less secure because of this.
Why does Windows operate that? Will you tell us why Windows operates that way versus
why of that? Okay, the short of that is Windows got started really with DOS, like the disk operating system, a very, very simple application that they wanted for the new IBM PC, and Microsoft won the contract for that, and boom, here you go, here's simple DOS. Pardon me. And DOS was an extremely simple operating system. And the early versions of Windows were all built on that. So Windows 1, 2, 3, 3.1, whatever, and then finally you get to like Windows 95. Right. They're all built on a DOS foundation. And DOS really isn't secure in any way. It has massive limitations in terms of how it manages files, like hard disks, like not the solid state ones, but classic hard disks. There's spinning disks in there and little arms that move on there. And with DOS and Windows systems, wherever the arm happened to be is where it dropped that little bit. So that you had to constantly defragment your disk, because which meant bring it all together, because otherwise it would just get slower and slower and slower, because the OS just at its core was not written well.
Does it go really slow and slow and slow?
Yeah, it just gets worse and worse. You had more and more blue screens, and everything's just going crazy with it. Basically, everything about the Windows system was kind of like ad hoc, just built on a really rotten foundation.
Got it.
And then they decided, okay, we're going to make something better, and they had to make something better for server spaces to run in, like in businesses.
Yes.
So they started developing Windows NT, but that project originally started as a joint project with IBM, and then they decided to hate each other and split off, and IBM released OS/2, and Microsoft released the first version of Windows NT, or new technology. And that was a major improvement, because it actually tossed DOS. It had a DOS emulator for things, but it wasn't actually based on it. But it's still based on some really badly done code that still links together the user space with the kernel of the OS. So it crashes less often, but it still can happen. So your servers running NT could still go, oops, sorry, blue screen, something went wrong there. Right. It was a bit better in terms of how it protected the applications, the user space. Security was much better on it. So ever since then, for more than 20 years now, the basic file management system, the file system for hard drives for Windows, the NTFS, was a file system that actually does have native security for it, which DOS does not. You cannot protect any files. You can't encrypt files. You can't say, well, this file belongs to Jamal and this file belongs to Liam, and Liam can't see Jamal's file. That's impossible in a Windows 95 system. But it is possible in an NT system. But still, again, it's not a very well-designed file system, and its security is not nearly the equal of any of the ones that you have seen developed for Unix systems, which is why all the way to the present, you worked in banking for 30 years, right? Yeah. The behind-the-scenes machines running all the banking and financial data, that's all Unix machines. They're doing all that stuff on like, Solaris or AIX or some, HPUX, some major commercial Unix has always done like financial stuff. Or before that, sometimes they would run like on old AS400s, like an IBM mini computer.
Yeah.
But then you'd have other systems that you would have to interface with that. And then they had to write software layers to connect the people running at the desktops and how it accesses that data.
Got it.
No one wanted to store like really important financial data on a Windows machine. And Microsoft has been trying ever since to get over that, to try and get it to be stable enough to really work. But it's just steadily building incrementally on, honestly, some design flaws that go all the way back to OS2 and the earliest Windows NT, which is why it still does have security issues. You know that people have to have virus scanners on Windows machines, right?
Yep. I see that all the time.
Yeah, I don't. I don't have to worry about viruses because they're almost impossible to write for Linux and Unix systems. They can't actually take the system down. They can't do a whole lot of damage because everything is sort of sequestered. In Linux and Unix systems, every single thing it's all files. You can edit everything manually. Everything is sort of separated from it, and individual files can actually corrupt things because you don't actually run your system with the permissions to do that.
Got it. Does it matter what computer you use? Like what kind of computer do you have for it to run a certain like Linux operating system?
Good question. Yeah. There's not a lot of variation anymore. There used to be a lot of variation in platforms. Originally, a lot of the Unix variants were all written for specific microprocessors. Mm-hmm. So specific types of like, RISC-based processors, RISC, and everyone was kind of proprietary there. So, IBM had their power processor, right? And the power processors, AIX would run on those, but so they're all like very specific originally. The Spark processor for Sun Microsystems, for the Solaris would run on, but almost all of them have died out because the CISC-based processors that we think of today for the common PC model have gotten so good that they eliminate the early advantages that all the other microprocessors had. Today, the only major difference is there's a whole bunch of really stripped down simple ones, like the like all the ones that you'll see in devices, mobile phones or like, household electronics, because those have an operating system on them too, but they use a much simpler processor because it doesn't need to do as much.
Got it.
But Intel and AMD are both making the same type of, they're compatible processors, and they power most machines. Even the Macs used to use different processors, and they've given that up, and they've all adopted the same basic standard. So technically speaking, Linux can run on any of these, but not only does it run on any basic machine like that because the processors are similar, there are variants of Linux that run on everything. You can run Linux on like the little Acorn processors, like on tiny equipment. People often use it for embedded devices. Anybody who has an Android phone is actually running Linux and probably doesn't know it, because Android is a Linux variant.
Got it.
Tons and tons of the devices that you'll buy for your house, like little smart devices, are actually running stripped down versions of Linux, because it's a lot more reliable than putting the stripped down versions of Windows on them. And it's cheaper, less resource intensive, and you can customize it. You can still literally make a Linux variant that fits on a floppy disk, or you can run massive servers or desktop gaming computers with them. So the flexibility of it is one of its main advantages, and something I could talk about when we talk about the economics of it.
That's good. I kind of take you there, because why do we hear more about, Windows, their operating system versus Linux is off as much?
Yeah. Okay. So let's take it back to thinking about just the story of common computer operating systems, right? Mm-hmm. So initially you have a lot of industrial applications, servers, and then terminals would connect into the different servers or whatever. And then you're starting to move to like workstations. So you can do like complex drawing. So engineers would have workstations, and all these are much more complicated computers than people would have. But then you have access suddenly to like the personal computer revolution. How can I make computers cheap enough that people can have them in their houses? They were still damned expensive in the 80s, like you're thousands and thousands of dollars. But Apple and Microsoft, or Apple and really IBM and the IBM compatibles, were like the two major pioneers there. So you've got the an IBM design, based on the x86 processor. That's the ancestor technically of pretty much all of the computers you can buy today. And then the early Apple ones, which originally used different types of hardware. But those were the two that really kind of took off in consumer space. There were originally a lot of competitors. Again, I had a Texas Instruments computer as my first thing. There was a lot of competition. There was a lot of different companies competing in the space, and eventually it just sort of gets winnowed down to two major ones, at least for consumer computers, right? And the reason they both survived is they both had different advantages. Microsoft's main advantage was in the business. It was a very predatory business. It bundled things together. It made sweetheart deals with original equipment manufacturers, the OEMs, to bundle it. So if I'm going to go and buy an HP computer, it's going to have Windows already pre-installed. So it's just folded into the price. So you're just forced to buy a Windows license in order to buy the computer because they made their deals that way. So it's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that end up creating Microsoft's dominance, their relationship to the equipment manufacturers that kind of made it ubiquitous. Apple thrived for a long time because it was good at a handful of things that Windows was never really good at. The whole mouse and graphical display, which actually came out of government labs and things like Park, and with a combination working with Xerox or whatever, totally separate, but everyone sort of like borrowed the idea and started working with it, right? We all have like the mouse and the graphical interface. The way that Apple's worked was far more accurate. So it made it really useful for graphic artists. You could consistently click exactly the same pixel over and over and over again, which is really difficult with a lot of other systems. The mouse will slip a little bit. So for people doing art, Apple took off, and then they also focused on trying to really radically simplify the interface.
And they made it very difficult. Those two operating systems made it very difficult to enter the industry. There was a lot of barriers to entry as they were growing. Yeah, exactly.
They both carved out a separate niche. So Apple focused on people who wanted a very simple interface, or they wanted full integration of a whole bunch of different products together, or they were doing graphic art, things like that. They had their or and to some degree music. They had some areas that they really were good at, and then Microsoft worked with all the companies in order to lock things in, and that just made it sort of ubiquitous in corporate America too. So company X needs to buy a bunch of computers. Well, they're going to buy a bunch of computers from Compaq, and boom, they all have Windows on them. So they're a Windows shop, and that's just the end of that. And it got really difficult to get in because once things like that are established, then you're locked into certain applications. So think about word processing, right? There used to be a ton of different word processors. WordStar, WordPerfect, Microsoft Word. There was tons of different ones out there, but they all had incompatible file formats. So the more Microsoft got companies to bundle in Office along with their Windows purchase, the more documents were produced in Microsoft formats, the harder it was for any of those other companies to compete. The same basic dynamic works in tons of other areas. It basically like prices things out. If everything is in a Microsoft specific format, then for me to compete with a different operating system, I have to kind of be able to read their files. I have to work with their stuff. I have to reverse engineer how a lot of Microsoft stuff works, which is more complicated. One of the reasons that this is honestly so interesting now, but was already getting interesting by the late 90s, is we've been moving more and more toward uniform standards.
Tell us more.
So just thinking in terms of like your Office files again, right? So Microsoft Word documents, technically, it's just writing an XML file. It just dresses it up in a docx container and calls it a Microsoft doc file. But technically speaking, it's still just producing XML that anything can read, which means that you can make other software that's fully compatible and can read those files. I use LibreOffice, which is a fork from OpenOffice, which is a completely free Office suite that does everything Microsoft Office does, but uses less resources and costs nothing. And the code is fully open.
And it's called what now? Libre?
Libre. It's a long-term story here, but it starts off as like Star Office. The source is opened up for it and becomes Open Office, but then Open Office is acquired by Apache, which uses the Apache license instead of the full GPL. This gets very confusing here, but there are different software licenses for open source and free software. So we should come back to that moment when define free software for people.
Yes, that'd be good.
but when OpenOffice decided to start using the Apache license instead of GPL, they forked from it, and that's one of the neat things you can do with free software. So let's take a step back here a second and define what we mean by free software or open source.
Go for it.
I'm stuck a lot using the term open source because it got to be more widely known. I tend to prefer free software, but that confuses people too, because people think, oh, free as in no cost.
Right.
Well, generally speaking, that's true too, but it's actually free as in freedom, because software that you purchase generally, okay, so I'm going to go buy a copy of Microsoft Office and install it on my computer. That software is already what they call compiled. The code for it has been run through a machine that pulls it together into a single executable. It pulls it together into files and you can't read those. You can't just decompile and read the code for it.
Right.
It's locked in, and you have no real control over that. Free software or open source software, you can get it already as an executable, but you can actually just download the source code yourself and compile it yourself, which means you can modify it, you can tweak it, you can say, I don't like that it does this. Hey, I want to make this application purple. Tweak the code, recompile it, boom, the application's purple. Like you have total control over it, which means that other people can contribute to projects. So I've got this stuff together, I've got this code going, and I can say, hey, damn, I got this problem here. It's always crashing when I do X, Y, or Z problem. I can reach out to other hackers and say, hey, do you know how this works? And somebody says, oh yeah, you've got a bug here, blah, blah, blah. They fix that. It's like, the whole like many hands make light work, or many eyes make a problem, less, you're throwing more people at it. You can solve a problem. You're not dependent on calling up a company and saying, hi, your software is buggy. Cool, we'll release an update in 6 months maybe. You can literally go fix it yourself or ask somebody else to fix it. So the freedom that you have with that and the extensibility of it, the customizability, this is why Linux can still run on just tiny resources or on massive servers. You can fit it into any possible use that you want, because all of the software, the code is free. The code is open. It's accessible.
Got it.
So, but that also, it makes it harder to, okay, think of it this way. A lot of commercial software will have bugs in it, like glitches, problems. And some of those can affect security. Oh, we have a security glitch here, and now it's released everyone's social security numbers because they broke into our systems, right? And you got to count on the manufacturer of that software to fix the problem, right? But free software, anybody can see the code, which means it has been gone over so many times looking for those bugs that security exploits are really hard to make. And they're solved immediately. And there's a patch out there. Somebody's like immediately plugged a hole if one shows up. But because everyone can see how to get into it, all the holes have already been stoppered for the most part. It's a lot harder. On top of that, as far as security, just a simple one there. Again, there's a major separation between the user space applications and the operating system on any kind of like NIX system, Unix, Linux, whatever. So the applications don't directly control the operating system. They can't affect it in the same way. And you, as a user, don't have the privileges to do it. Where oftentimes as a Windows user or Mac user, your privileges are elevated enough that you can actually harm your computer. Just as a fun aside, like my mother ran a child care center for decades, right?
Funny.
So from the late 70s until just a few years ago, she was running a child care center in her house. And I set up computers for her, right? And I just took, some old PCs and put on a nice stripped down version of Linux that made good, effective use of that hardware, and then added all kinds of fun things for them, like emulators for arcade games. The old classic arcade games you would go in and put your quarter and play. So it had an emulator on them, so they could play all these classic arcade games on them and all kinds of stuff. Those computers were bulletproof. They sat there working in her playroom with tons of kids playing on them, writing their homework on there, surfing the internet, playing games. Those machines worked for almost 20 years.
No way. It's funny you should say that. Not to digress.
When she retired.
Summer ran a daycare center for 13 years out of our home as well.
Oh, neat. That's cool. Yeah. we can talk about that sometime, actually. I mean, growing up in one was really kind of fascinating. She started it when I was, I guess, 5 or something.
Oh, yeah. The kids
like
all grew
a dozen kids running around.
The kids all grew up we started in the apartment, and then transitioned when we bought the house and converted the garage into a daycare center. And so I can relate to that. Yeah.
That's neat. Yeah,
at some point I have to have you write one of those old-fashioned video games into my computer. Because I miss those things.
Yeah, the emulators are pretty easy to set up, and the ROMs for them, the actual the game executable files, that they're just available on the internet. You can download them from places.
Cool. So you can put in Pac-Man and Galaga and all that. All right, guys.
Yeah, they're easy enough to find. I can show you how to find that stuff and put them in there. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the old manufacturers don't necessarily like that, but what are they going to do? They don't care. They're games from the 80s.
So hit up Liam for Pac-Man and Galaga and all that good stuff. So
yeah. But either way, the way that it's much more stable is a big architectural advantage of it. But it is a little harder to, to break into, I guess, the popular consciousness. But it was starting to in the 90s, and there was a movement there for a while, and it did actually affect some businesses. I got this old shirt. This is from a convention in Vegas in '99. So I've had this shirt for a while, but it's like a Linux magazine logo in the back of it. It's from a little convention.
Give us a look at the back.
I don't know if you can see it there.
Just move your hair. Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
Yeah. But the movement into businesses really got going in the later 90s and has never really stopped. A lot of corporations did find uses for it, and it did replace a lot of the proprietary Unix systems. So where people were running very, very expensive HPUC systems or AIX systems, Solaris systems, they just said, they went over to Unix. And a lot of web servers, like Microsoft really struggled to compete with their IIS web server. Like you could run websites on a Windows machine.
Right.
Never terribly successful because, again, it's a lot easier for people to take the thing down, to shut the site down. And Linux, not only is it harder to break into, but you can actually distribute the processing over multiple systems as well. You can easily build effective clusters for things for websites. So your website is actually running on 50 different computers. And so it can handle massive traffic and whatnot. That's a lot harder to do with some of the commercial stuff. And Linux really took off for that. But there was an effort at the time to try and also make it appealing for desktop users. And that honestly failed. And it's maybe kind of sad ever since. I've used Linux on my desktops and laptops since '95. So within the first few years of it, finally stabilizing with a good user interface for it, I switched from Unix systems to running Linux and have ever since. So it's not like you couldn't do it the whole time. It's not like the basic capabilities were ever not there. I could always do Office documents and game and everything else. But it never really took off in those spaces the way it did for a lot of businesses.
You all right?
Yeah, it's just something in my throat.
So now there's going to be a lot of, hopefully a good amount of people watching this. What are some things they need to take away? Again, to me, that's a lot of information, and it's good information, but I'm a novice, right? And there's some folks that are novice. So what do I extract from what you just shared? What are things for me, home use? Yeah.
Let's get to some core lessons.
Yeah.
Right. First, there is the basic ethical consideration. Free software is free. You have control over it. No one can extort something from you. Think about the way that Apple's always forcing people to upgrade and buy the next new iPhone or whatever. Right. When you're working with a commercial company, you're stuck with that. And honestly, today, just very short tangent, the Apple systems are actually more reliable than they used to be, because when Steve Jobs came back to the company, he brought the intellectual property from the second company he'd started, like Next Step, and brought its operating system in. And Next was based on Unix. So the current Apple computers are based on BSD Unix, which means they're functionally very similar to Linux. They just have all this Cocoa, whatever, this fancy desktop on top of it. But you can actually open up a terminal and you can work with it the same way you can any other Unix or Linux system. So it's a lot more stable as a system. But they hide a lot of that, and they lock you into their interface and all their applications and all their products, so they can keep you on that upgrade cycle exactly the same way Microsoft does. Microsoft releases a new one, and then, oh, sorry, we don't support that version of Windows anymore. You have to upgrade. And they're constantly pushing out the new versions, and you have to keep buying. Oh, it's a new version of Office. Okay, got to buy the new version of Office because they're not supporting the old one, blah, blah, blah. And so you're just sort of stuck on that. None of that is true with free software. You have total control over it. Again, you can maintain it. You can keep them updated security-wise. You can run on very old equipment. I could still, I mean, again, those computers I had running in my mother's daycare center, they were old. But the operating system I put on it, the way I structured the interface for it, it was stripped down enough that it didn't matter. It didn't need a lot of resources to do what they were going to do. It's the whole, like, have you ever heard the expression, Intel giveth and Microsoft taketh away?
No, I haven't.
With the biblical language. So Intel produces the chips, the microprocessors, right? And then a new one comes out that's fancier, more powerful, more cores in it, can do more awesome stuff. And then Microsoft writes more bloated code that uses up all the resources. So the actual user experience doesn't get much better year after year. It's the same old stuff, and it can still slow down and work the same way because the code is so bloated. You have a lot more control over it, and there's a lot more variety in terms of the provider. So Linux isn't a company. Linux isn't a single thing. Linux is, again, just the kernel, and the kernel is free software. And then there's a whole bunch of what we call distributions. That's people who package this stuff. So SUSE packages stuff, Red Hat packages stuff. There's a whole bunch of companies that take all the different pieces of free software, link them all together into a single interface, slap their logo on it, and give you a single installable. Boom, here's how you put this on your computer. And it works for people. You know, it makes it nice and easy to do. But it doesn't, going from one to the other isn't a big deal. It doesn't change anything. You're not locked in. I've used tons of different distributions over the decades, you know, and it doesn't matter.
So for you, you mentioned something earlier that really stood out, which is, look, you have a body, a frame, a shell. As long as the software on the inside is good, to your point, can last for years, like what you talked about in terms of your mom's childcare. So if I had a computer from 1995, and again, simple guy here, and I asked you to do what you did in your mom's home, would you be able to do that? And
you could absolutely still use that old hardware.
Yeah.
I mean, it can't do all the fanciest stuff you'd use now. I mean, I wouldn't try to do like 3D model rendering on a computer from 95. Totally. But you could absolutely turn it back into a usable computer again.
Yeah.
Because there's so much variation. There's so many, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of distributions, all for different purposes. Different chips, different requirements, different hardware types, you know, different resources that are available. So some are targeted like gamers and multimedia stuff. So I run I often run Mint on a laptop because it's really good with a lot of AV type stuff. You know, it kind of specializes in those areas. But I wouldn't run it on every system. You know, I didn't run it on like my little netbooks. I don't run it on my media center in the living room. I mean, there's all kinds of different ones you can use for different purposes, right? And they're very specialized that way. So it's a lot more flexible. Plus, again, ethically speaking, it's free and you can't be locked in. No one can come along later and demand a license. Think about with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act they passed. If you have a pirated piece of software on your computer, if you're running a Microsoft application illegally, they can literally hit the end user with $100,000 fine.
Yeah.
For every application that's pirated.
So question for you then. So speaking of like hardware, how often do you replace your hardware? Like I have a computer that's now 4 years old. And I'm thinking of replacing it just to be a little more adept to the things that we do, right? Do I need to replace it, or what do I need to do?
It really depends on what you're doing. If you're like a hardcore gamer and you want the best graphic rendering or whatever, then you're going to upgrade every few years easily, because otherwise the resource use gets harder for the older systems. But for a lot of people, if they're just going on the internet, writing documents, you could use a 20-year-old computer and it wouldn't make any damn difference at all. This is why so many people can get away with using tablet computers, right? Or their phone. right?
Yeah.
Or like those Chromebooks or netbooks that are really stripped down and run off the internet. You know, you don't need a lot of resources from most applications these days. Yeah, I mean the actual hardware in that is not particularly sophisticated. Like it doesn't have a lot of power, but
yeah,
it's enough, you know, for what people are using them for, which is fine. It just depends. Like you're doing, you know, video editing, gaming.
Yeah, graduate school, and this was a part of the tuition, and so I didn't know you can use it for a lot of things until I like dove in. So good call out on that, and it isn't that sophisticated.
There's all kinds of neat things you can do with those. Honestly, this sort of a completely side point, but tons of those that equipment can easily be you know, hacked, so to speak. You can access them. You can do all kinds of things. So you can like, I can unlock phones and do what I want to them. You know, like actually tweak the way the operating system works, or tablets, whatever. You can actually get into them and alter the way they work, because at their core, they're often a Linux system, so they're easy to work with.
If you had my cell phone, you can unlock it and mess around with it.
Depends on the phone, but generally speaking, yeah, they're not that difficult to get into.
iPhone.
Oh, I don't have as much experience with iPhones, but technically speaking, I mean, I could probably figure it out. I mean, the Darwin kernel that they use for OS 10, there's a variant of that they use in iOS. It still has ultimately a kind of Unix base to it, but it's not my area of expertise. So I know about like Mac stuff. The only time I ever got somebody gave me a used Mac, and I used the MacBook for a while. I ended up completely ignoring the interface and doing most things with the console because I couldn't stand it.
I have a hard time with Mac.
As I got back from a trip, I erased it and put, well, at the time it was called Yellow Dog Linux, which is run for that hardware. I couldn't stand the Mac OS.
I can't. My kids and my wife have a Mac, but I am not like, I'm comfortable with the regular HP, Microsoft Word, the really basic stuff. When I try to use their computers, it's too complex for me.
Yeah, it's just different. I mean, technically speaking, if that's where you started, their interface is usually a little easier, but it's also, it holds your hand too much. It limits what you can actually do. In order to try and make it more stable, they lock you out of a lot of things.
Yeah.
But it works for a lot of people. It makes it very simple and more bulletproof. So they again, Windows and Mac all have their different advantages and niches that they've fallen into. But you can emulate a lot of same basic features in any of them. If somebody really likes the way the Mac interface works, I can completely emulate that on Linux. I can make it look exactly like a Mac. You know, I mean, it's because people have reverse engineered how to make it look that way and built their own desktop environments. And because again, it's so extensible and flexible, right? You can do whatever you want.
What part does Google play into this? Like,
interesting question.
In terms of their entry into the industry,
Google's a fascinatingly weird company and kind of evil, despite their little tagline about not being evil. But largely because their business model is actually based on learning everything about you and then using that to target advertising. And they make nearly all their money through the targeted advertising because it's able to scan all of your email and everything. Technically speaking, humans don't have access to that data, but some machine has it all on there and knows who you are and everything that you searched for and everything that you've ever written or whatever. It has all that and can say, I think Jamal really likes that, might really like this particular supplement because other people who do this martial arts like this supplement, and boom, there's an ad.
Right.
So
Amazon does the same thing, though. I mean, their algorithms pick up
exactly all do this.
Your habits.
One of the worst things about the modern tech economy is that we're not really the consumers, we're the products. We're what they're making money off of, right? All of their applications are meant to gather something about us and then resell that to somebody else. And they all make tons of cash on that. For this specific thing, what Google has done really well is by putting a lot of applications directly on the internet. So Google Docs and Sheets and all that stuff, and then the browsers and Drive to store your data, all the cloud type stuff. You can run much simpler machines now. So the whole netbook phenomenon, which is a really stripped down computer that doesn't have a lot of local storage or processing power because everything's done remotely, works. There's a whole category of them now that we call Chromebooks, because they're based on Google's Chrome OS, which is a stripped down form of Linux that they've customized to run on these machines. It kind of locks you in the same way like tablets do, but they're even easier to break into because it's Linux based. But it's basically just it's to simplify the machine for people who don't need a lot of complicated stuff. If you're just browsing the web and writing documents and emails and editing your family trips photos or something like that, you don't need a fancy computer. You can absolutely get by with a Chromebook. So Google's has been good at like taking some elements of like Linux and commercializing them through Chrome OS and then through Android that runs like a lot of the other smartphones, right? Android is just a stripped down form of Linux that runs on the smartphones. It gives, again, because they're ultimately free and open source software, it gives them the ability to do that. They can do what's called forking. They can take an existing, version of some software and then bring it in-house, and then all their new improvements, they don't have to release to the public. So it kind of becomes their own sort of commercial entity. Whenever that tends to happen, the free software community says, well, fuck that, and then forks it and like continues to develop it their own way, which is why you end up with different versions of things, because a lot of people want to keep things totally free and open, but companies do keep taking things in. Ultimately, Google built Android and Chrome OS on the backs of tens of thousands of hackers' labor that did it because they wanted to do it. It's a labor of love to build something that they wanted to work, and they're making money off of that.
Makes sense. So what's next? So we talked about the difference in software. We talked about barriers to entry slightly because of Apple and Microsoft. So what do we cover next?
Deals, yeah.
Yep. So what do we cover next for the audience? Where do you want to go?
Yes, we talked a little bit about ethics. We talked a little bit about the security of it. The last thing I think I'd want to really make a good point about that I think is kind of worthwhile to people, because at the end of the day, everyone's going to choose a system that works for them, right? If you're really into matching all your stuff and you love the cult of Apple, cool, keep buying apples, great. Everyone can do their own thing, and they all again have their advantages. For many ethical reasons, I have a problem with commercial software, but you may have noticed I have strong anti-capitalist bias too. So there's that.
Which
I don't mind
why you have a problem with capitalist software.
It's like I don't mind people making money off of packaging the services and whatnot and bringing things together. It's like, cool, I've linked all these things together and I've made this distribution of Linux. Give me $10 for that, right? But still keep the software free. If you're trying to close it and then change it and make it proprietary, I have a real problem, because proprietary software is a form of control. It's a straitjacket. It ties you into something. And this is the biggest problem with corporate America today, especially on the desktop side and for a lot of homes in America, because most of them are actually running Microsoft systems. And Microsoft has a virtual monopoly in that way. And they have done a lot to try and trap. They spend more effort trying to trap people into that than they do actually improving their software. Because at the end of the day, it's literally about control. It's about creating a captive audience. You have to buy my software. You have to buy the things that are compatible with what I want to do. If I change the software, then all the companies that want to run on it all have to change to match. Everyone is tied to this system. And at the end of the day, somebody is raking in all the cash just because they own all those patents. And all those patents, that's my big problem with it ethically. But it also, okay, economically speaking, there are two really good points you can make here. One, obviously free software makes good sense for, I don't know, all your socialists out there, because again, free is in freedom, right? So it's got that. But also free is in cost. So cool. But it's also really compelling if you think about it in purely capitalistic terms. Because think about my business. I have a business and there are, say, 500 workers and they all have their desks and they all have a computer on their desk, right?
Right.
Do I want to be trapped into a system where I need to upgrade the hardware and software every 2 or 3 years forever? do I want to surrender that control to somebody else and have that be on that constant upgrade cycle? And then because it's more complicated to maintain and buggier, I have to hire more IT nerds to watch this stuff and answer the help desk, you know, and answer basic questions on how to do stuff. Like the constant problems you have with that, the costs that go into that are phenomenal. But because a lot of companies don't want to put the effort into the moving away from it, like they just get stuck on this inertia and they just count in, well, I'm gonna have to spend millions of dollars a year no matter what, and you just keep doing that forever rather than doing it once in order to transition and then never having to do it again. And then you make essentially a bulletproof office of systems that, you know, will just keep working and working, and you upgrade them whenever the hell you feel like it. You change things when you feel like it, and you have control over that. And I mean, as one, what you put one Unix nerd in the server room and he can actually access every room in the building and do all the corrections from there. You don't have to run over to people's computers and, you know, and look at all the stuff and fix stuff. And, you know, you can just maintain them all remotely. I used to write scripts that would do all kinds of maintenance, you know, at night when everyone was gone, you know, just in the background.
So why haven't you developed that software?
I was always much more of a network geek and a hardware geek. I'm a relatively lousy coder. Writing software is not my thing.
But you could do it.
I could write scripts, but I never learned how to write coded, you know, compiled software because it's not my thing. By the time you get into really mastering things like, you know, C and C++ and, you know, doing like, you know, all the object oriented programming, all this stuff, it's like doing maths, and I hate maths. You know, show me like, you know, some trig or calculus problems, and I'm going to run the opposite direction.
Yeah, you and me both.
It's not my thing.
Just give me the basic math.
But I could write like, you know, Perl scripts and Python scripts and whatnot. You know, I could do all kinds of stuff like that. So,
question for you: if I'm looking to buy and I want to just bring it to like a consumer, right? I'm looking to buy a computer. It's my first time, or maybe my second time. Now I'm contemplating, you know, what has longevity? What can I have for a long period of time without having to upgrade? Where do I go to kind of stack rank the hardware, the software? Where are resources that I can connect to, and how do I go about finding that?
Resources as in specific websites or something?
Yeah, like if I want to buy a computer, or where do I go type in top 10 computers to buy, and how do I know that's really the top 10?
Oh gosh. I mean, there are some good sites that have been around forever, like Tom's Hardware and Slashdot that do really good that break down all the different, or Ars Technica breaks down good things. They do reviews or whatever. So those are three that I still quite like that do a lot of hardware type stuff.
Can you repeat those three again for us one more time? Tom's Hardware.
Actually, I haven't opened up Tom's in a long time. Somebody will have to look and see if it's still there. But Tom's Hardware was a really good tech site for a long time that did good reviews and wrote things down. So you can just Google Tom's Hardware, or Ars Technica, ARS, and then Technica, and then Slashdot. Slashdot.org is a good, like, you know, general news forum, so that keeps all the tech news out there. You can keep up with a lot of stuff that way. For picking the right machine, the first thing you need to figure out is what's my intended use, right? Because a database server versus a gaming PC are very different machines, right? So what you want to do with it should be the chief thing. And people are always selling things like, oh, this has the latest stuff. Think about all those like car salesman memes, like slapping the hood, like, yeah, this baby can do all this stuff. I'm like, yeah, but do I really need to go like 250 miles an hour on the street? I mean, it's like you got to figure out what are the actual features that you want, not just that it's new and technically cool. And oftentimes most people don't need, you know, the fancy ass shit, but you're going to look for really complicated specific rigs for gamers, or, you know, different types of server applications, or for video rendering, audio rendering. So like our editor Danny, if he's going to do like, you know, audio editing for his music, like would want a specific rig that's genuinely good at that, you know, that it can really run the kind of software that would work for that. So you got to know what your software is, what your needs are. And then you can look into things. And if people are interested in exploring Linux, two things to keep in mind. One is Make sure whatever hardware you're looking at has a compatible distribution you can run on it, because sometimes they put in really shitty proprietary things that are harder to get working. But generally speaking, almost all equipment will work out of the box in one way or another. But what I often do is, the little USB drives. I'll put like a live image of Linux on that, and I'll just go into like a computer store. I'll go into like a Best Buy, and like, so somebody wants a computer, and they're like, help me pick out a computer. I'm like, cool. I'm going to go into Best Buy. I'm going to plug the thing in, and when no one's looking, reboot the computer to a live image and run Linux on it for a minute and test all the hardware. And then, oh, okay, cool, this one works. Or like, but you can find out quickly, oh, well, no, the Wi-Fi chip in this one doesn't work, or the graphics driver on this one is crap, so you don't want to do that. An easier way is often just to go to websites and look, because a lot of OEMs, let's see, Lenovo, using the old IBM ThinkPad stuff, or HP, they both do a lot of Linux builds. Dell does Linux builds. I think they still do them. You can actually like order some machines directly on it. So they'll tell you what equipment that they have certified will run on Linux. And then there's also tons of user forums where people have said, this printer works, this computer works, blah, blah, blah. They've all tested it, and you can look that up. So if you're curious about any particular piece of equipment you want to buy, you can literally just Google the model number, type in the model number and say Linux compatibility, and it'll take you to a forum where people will talk about whether it works.
Got it. Do I need to spend $3,000 on a computer to get the things done? No. Yeah. How much should I be spending?
It depends very much on the person, and what you want to do, right? So again, if you want to if you're a gamer, you're probably going to spend $3,000 or $4,000 on your computer. Yeah. But if you're mom writing emails and surfing the web, then no, you could spend a few $100 and get like a nice netbook type machine, and you're fine. And honestly, whoever's helping mom with her computer will do a lot less tech support if you get a simpler machine.
Sure, of course, it's not that complex.
Again, you always look at the what the actual use is, and this again is one of my pet peeves about this from a purely capitalistic standpoint, is that businesses are constantly having to roll out really expensive Windows upgrades with a ton of features that they don't want in their offices, and that cause all kinds of security problems for them because it's all tightly integrated. You're stuck with tons of bloat that you don't need. They're like bundling tons of things in there that you just don't want on your business systems. Having that flexibility really matters.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I think purpose, what's the use? You don't need to spend an exorbitant amount of money to have a really good computer. But I think defining your use is essential, and then going from there. And then you gave us 3 good websites to determine, what's quality out there, which I appreciate.
Yeah, some good reviews. Like you get to see what are some of the nicest hardware out there. What are some cool things. I got tired of buying machines and then stripping off Windows. So I started buying from specific Linux manufacturers. So my current machine is from System 76. So it's a native Linux machine. So there's tons of companies that do that as well. So instead of having to go and buy a Dell or an HP or whatever, you can just go to a direct equipment manufacturer that does it for you. And then you have no compatibility issues at all with them.
Wow.
If you're again thinking about converting, right, and you want to experiment with running a Linux system, then again, keep in mind what you use your computer for, what applications you use. Many of them have an easy analog. So Microsoft Office, you'll be fine with OpenOffice or LibreOffice. And it has a lot of features that Microsoft Office wouldn't have, or you'd have to pay more for, like native export to Adobe's Acrobat, little PDF formats. So for file compatibility, I always just, if I got to share files with somebody, I just export as a PDF, and it looks exactly like I want it to look on any machine. So a lot of software, very easy conversions. And then tons of other things, they're the same. Like if your web browser is going to work the same on one system or the other, you can make the interface look however you want. There's tons of variations of that. I actually use a fairly stripped down user interface called XFCE rather than a lot of the more fancy ones, because I don't need a lot of like weird fades and funky transition effects as it's opening up a freaking file folder. Like I just want to open the file folder and see it. So you have a lot of choice in how you can make things look. So if you're comfortable with the way Mac looks, make it look like a Mac. If you're comfortable with the way Windows looks, make it look like any version of Windows that's ever existed. There's Linux desktops that look like all of them, or you can experiment with things that look nothing like any of them. but some things won't work properly. And for many of them, there are good emulators. So the acronym WINE, WINE is not an emulator. It's actually a re-implementation of large parts of the Windows codecs. So you can actually run Windows software native on Linux. Some software works really well with that. There are some games that work beautifully in WINE, others don't. So it just really depends on the application. So you, with very specific ones that I need this piece of software, it only works in Windows. So for a while, for language learning, I would use Rosetta Stone's software, right? And Rosetta Stone, it ran on Windows. And I found it worked really shitty in WINE. So I used an emulator to run an old like Windows XP virtual machine inside my Linux machine. So I didn't have to use a different computer. I didn't have to reboot the computer. I would run Windows on top of Linux just to run Rosetta Stone. And then eventually I found an alternative to that, an alternative way to do that, and then tossed that. So I haven't needed that for many years. But if you have a piece of Windows software that only works in Windows and you need it for work, you can usually emulate it in some way. You know, run it through some kind of emulator, like VirtualBox is a free one, or VMware is a commercial one that runs the operating system you need on top of it for that software. Or some of them can be run on top of Linux, you know, through some layer like WINE. But you want to look into that, you know. So this is a problem for like gamers or like engineers, certain CAD applications. For most users, never a problem. Most users' software requirements are simple enough that you don't run into these issues at all. But for some specialized purposes, not everyone can easily change off. Not everyone can easily just switch to Linux tomorrow. But realistically, most people could, and they would save a buttload of money. So
and people need to know that, because they feel like they're pigeonholed to use certain software when they're really not, right?
Exactly. We're made to feel trapped.
Yeah. And I wouldn't even know otherwise until today. I'm like, all right, I've got a couple of options to choose from, and I don't have anything else. But in reality, there are a lot of options, but we're made to believe that those are the only two that are out there, because people don't do the extensive research they need to identify what's economically beneficial.
Right. Yeah. That's all, again, very, very deliberate. And there used to actually be a lot more Linux distributions that really tried to break into that consumer desktop space. And people were really hopeful that they could do it, because they're like, hey, look, our computer's going to do exactly the same crap as the Windows machines. Everyone's going to come and buy that. Turned out, no, because most people get the operating system from the equipment manufacturer. So they don't think about it. They just take whatever they're given, right? And again, inertia carries us forward. We don't really think about the change. So a lot of those, you know, really, really struggle to take off. But there's a ton of stuff out there, and we keep developing this stuff. And again, the interfaces, I mean, they are every bit as sophisticated as anything you'll get from, you know, Windows or Mac.
As human beings, it's easy for us it's easy for us to conform.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, humans are herd animals. You know, we go with the flow most of the time. You know, we don't usually, you know, push ourselves to think outside the box. You know, but
we don't.
But the options are available.
It's getting better, though. I think there are more people that say, look, I don't need to be in this box. I can get out of this box and think on my own, and identify things that are more beneficial, even though without having the associated costs.
Right. We've always had people that are willing to buck the trends and do what they want to do. And what's nice is that we have the ability to help others to do it as well, to show them, look, you do have choices, and they're not as scary or daunting as you think.
Right.
You know, if you go back to early 90s and me installing Slackware and having to compile every part of the software manually in order to make it work, that was hard. You had to understand the computer at a very low level basis. You had to know how the hardware works, what spider chip is what, how everything functions, like, in order to really make it work properly. You don't anymore. Just, you can download an image off the internet, you know, put it on a USB, plug it in and install, and it's got like a little install wizard that's actually simpler than Microsoft's, you know, and it takes you all the way through it. Not only the thing it doesn't have is all those like license requirements and sign into this thing to get involved, and all the, because Microsoft requires you now to like log in to something in order to really use your computer, which means your computer is like Google. Microsoft is spying on you too.
Yeah.
So again, for people who care about security issues, Linux has serious advantages there. But yeah, the learning curve is today really small.
Yeah.
where in the 90s it wasn't. Realistically, it wasn't. We like to pretend it was easier than it was at the time, but it definitely would have taken a lot more for people to learn how to do it.
Well, because it was new. It was new is because it was new. I think part of that fact it was new. Today, things have advanced. People are more accustomed to using technology. I still see commercials of people using AOL for the first time, right? And that onset, it's like, but today, I think especially with the younger generation, they grew up with technology. They've advanced. I go to my 13-year-old, and she gives us hacks for various things. For example, gas. If you download an app from Chevron, and she figured this out, my 13-year-old, you get 3 pumps with $1 off each gallon. And so my point in terms of this younger generation, they've become accustomed to identifying ways to benefit them, unlike folks in the 90s where it's like, okay, this is new to me. How do I figure it out? Right.
They're much more digital native, which means they would have an easier time adapting to any of these kind of changes, switching the systems over and managing them just as well for other people. And again, you don't have to compile software anymore. Most of it will just update automatically through the internet. You can just have it set to like, in the security update, just put it on my computer and be done with it. Don't mess with it at all. Yeah. And there's all kinds of like easy ways to do it. If I want a new application on my computer, I can pull up a graphical application, type the name of the software, or click a button for it, and boom, it downloads and installs it itself. There's no effort at all, right? Remove software, you don't have to deal with things like the Windows registry and things getting corrupted. When you put software on Windows, taking it back off, it never comes completely off. With Linux systems, everything is a file, and it just deletes it. So there's no leftover junk to slow your machine down over time. And installing and uninstalling software is easier now on Linux than it is on Windows, where it used to be harder. Right. So the barriers to entry are much, much lower for most people, and yet we tend to be even less aware of it now, which is kind of sad.
Yeah. And it's intentional, to your point. It's made for you to feel that it's much more difficult. Right. So how do we wrap up this episode? So it's a great topic. I hope that people watching can find ways to first benefit economically, benefit from a technology perspective, and spread the word. Because I think what we've done today is kind of opened up a space for people to say, I didn't know this, or I did, but I need to communicate with others. I can't just hoard the information. So how do we wrap up the episode?
Yeah, as a simple point for anybody who's curious about this stuff, say you are ready to upgrade your computer, right? But your other one still works, but your other one's been around for a few years. It's getting slow, whatever. Don't throw it away right away. Just once you transition to the other machine, install Linux on the old one and start learning it from there. And then start picking things out. And then if you like it, if you find a distribution that works well for you, because again, they all look different, they all work differently, but there's tons of them out there. You can find one that's nice. Again, there's Distro Watch is a website that lists all of the existing current Linux distros and ranks them by popularity. So you can see what are the top ones now. I can try go to Distro Watch. Oh, look, this one's top rated. I'm gonna try Mint. I'm gonna try Ubuntu. I'm gonna see which one works. Try it on that machine. If it works well and you like it, great. Then what you can do is actually you can transition your new computer to it as well, or do what we call dual booting. So it's possible to take a Windows machine, or a Mac for that matter. It's got a big disk in it, right? You can shrink the partition so Windows is still on there, and then install Linux on the rest of it. So then when the computer starts, you get to choose which operating system you want to boot, which is useful for people who do still need a Windows application, but also useful for people as they're transitioning, as they're experimenting. I'm still used to doing this thing this way in Windows. Go to Windows and do it there, and then switch back over. The advantage is once you've mastered it, though, like not needing virus scanners, not needing the constant upgrades, making some of the applications so much simpler. The computers are much more bulletproof. I mean, the advantages are phenomenal, but it does take a little bit of, like anything else, you just got to figure out some new stuff there, right? But for the most part, all the same kinds of applications all already exist, and many of them function exactly the same way too. So it won't look any different. Again, I've gotten my 70-year-old parents using systems like this without any trouble at all. It's not a steep a learning curve as people tend to think. And an easy way to do that is when it's next time for you to upgrade, don't toss your old computer right away. Erase it, put Linux on it, and start learning from there.
And so for someone to download Linux, walk them through the steps. How would they do it?
Easiest one there is just go to DistroWatch, pick the one that you want. It'll have a link to the download pages for the different distributions. And you can choose whether you want to download an ISO directly from a particular site. So a lot of universities host these things too. So like tons of university servers will have like, they'll choose which Linux distros they like, and they'll like host them on their servers for free, and people can just download directly from there. Or you can use, if anybody knows how torrenting applications work, that's generally a faster way to do it, because it's downloading from multiple servers all at once. So it's going to pull from a whole bunch of different companies and universities, and build it much faster on your end.
Awesome.
But DistroWatch will have links to all that stuff directly, and that it pulls it all together in one nice little place.
Beautiful. Well, Liam, episode 11 in the books. I appreciate you walking us through the various software today. I thought that was helpful. I learned a lot. As always, I find the conversation interesting, and I just want people to know that you don't have to be pigeonholed to Microsoft and Apple. You can actually use other technology to get the things done that you need. My takeaways here are, to determine which best hardware you need in software, intended use, right? You talked about ethical usage of free software. You talked about Linux quite a bit. And those are my 3 takeaways, especially because I've got a couple of laptops we've had for a while. So I want to go back and see if I can download Linux and go from there. And the worst case scenario for me is at least I tried and then it worked or it didn't work. That's the one thing I want people to take away is if you don't try, you don't know, right? You got to take that first step and go from there.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. And again, for a lot of people too, especially in the world today where we're so interconnected and where there's so much data being moved around and where it's so easy to get into stuff. I mean, again, back in my days doing security consulting, we used to have a phenomenon we call it war driving. You could drive around and like find someone's Wi-Fi open. Oh, this one's unsecured. Go right into it. And then get onto their computer and break into the computer. But you could do the same thing with companies too. So like I'm telling you, okay, so you need to upgrade this stuff, and it will cost me like $3,000 in equipment to do this. And they're like, well, I don't want to spend that money. Okay, let me show you why. And then in a few minutes I break into their computer and show them their files. Right? It's still relatively easy to do a lot of that stuff. And there's a reason virus scanners have to be constantly updated on machines. Linux is a lot more stable that way too. So if you're concerned at all about any kind of operational security, any kind of business security, like protecting your data, protecting your home data, then it just makes a lot more sense that way too. So it's another one at least for people to carry forward. But yeah, I hope people got something out of this. This was kind of a fun impulse. There were some people talking about this and like, hey, what should I do about this? I'm like, oh gosh, I could probably do a quick run through of some of the points in the podcast today.
No, so if you're watching this, you're watching it on YouTube. You can check us out on Podbean for audio, Apple, iHeart, Amazon, and Spotify. We have some great episodes coming up, right, Liam? We've got a recurring visitor, a financial advisor to come talk about 401ks, long-term investments, the market, and the trends. We have more attorneys from the ICC and ICJ coming up. We also have Lexi Alexander coming on the 27th of August. She's a Palestinian director, Oscar-winning director, so we're looking forward to that. So we've got a great lineup coming up for you guys here in the next several weeks and beyond. We ask that you comment, let us know what you think. Liam does a pretty good job of jumping in and responding. I got to get better at doing that. I'm going in tonight and responding to the comments on YouTube. Otherwise, have a blessed day. Take care of each other. But first and foremost, take care of yourself. Liam?
On episodes too. Quick point for everybody. I think we're taking next week off, aren't we?
We are. We're taking next week off. Liam's out of town. I'm out of town. So we'll be back the following week.
Nice that those co-assigned. And I think the week we come back, I think we might talk about some of the politics of Star Wars and Star Trek. Maybe
we are.
We're doing
some fun topics.
Yeah, we'll do there.
Serious stuff. a little bit, but we are doing that's your wheelhouse. I think you have a guest coming too for that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we'll have a guest, and we'll talk a little bit about like Star Wars and wade into some of the fun controversies around that. But yeah, when we get back into the fall too, we've got a bunch of those where we've laid down like a part 1 or something we got to get back to us later. But yeah, we've got a bunch of those to finish. We've got the financial advisor coming along. We've got Nicole will come back. There's all kinds of stuff coming up here. So stay tuned.
Yeah, well, thank you, Liam, as always. And we got to shout out Danny for editing this. We appreciate you, Danny. I love starting projects like this that become something that's long-term and grow and helping you helping me and getting together a community. And I think through the Discord, through TikTok, through the various platforms, we're building a really strong community. And for everyone that's supporting us, we can't express enough gratitude for all that you've done for us. So thank you as always. Appreciate your support.